Hi, my name is Lenora Billings-Harris, and welcome to More Than Just Talk. This special edition is a taped edition for you to honor May 25th, 2020, the day that George Floyd was murdered by a white police officer in Minneapolis. Due to the foresight of a teenager, Darnell Frazier, we watched this brutality nationally and internationally. People were outraged. And I just kind of wondered 2 years later, so what? Now what? So I invited two of my colleagues to share their experiences of these last 2 years. One is a colleague who's a consultant, and the other is an internal practitioner. I thought you might want to know. It's a success story. Because you have their bios in front of you, I'm not going to read it to you again. I thought I would just add a little more. So the first person you will hear from is my guest, Joe Gerst. He's a DEI expert, author, and facilitator. DEI, of course, stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a straight white male, which is how he describes himself, he is able to bring his perspective that causes many executives to listen in a different way and then make substantive change within their companies. Lisa Moore will follow him. Now, Lisa's title is Head of Jedi Experience with Guardian Life. Just her title is intriguing. She and her team have accomplished amazing successes over these last 2 years. I thought you might want to hear about it. So let me get out of the way so you can hear their words. Let's get started. I am thrilled to have an expert in DEI. You know that means diversity, equity, and inclusion. So an expert, an author, and consultant to help us think through what has been happening since the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. What's been happening in organizations? What have they been doing? And I'm thrilled to have Joe Gerst with me today. I know you've already read his bio, and I've given him a full introduction, so we want to jump right into it. Welcome, Joe. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Lenora. It's nice to see you.
You bet. My pleasure. So let's start with, overall, over these last 2 years, what progress have you seen different from what organizations were doing pre-George Floyd?
I think one of the big things that stands out to me is there's been a lot of organizations and a lot of leaders, a lot of senior executives, including white male executives, that have been speaking openly about things like systemic racism and white privilege and male privilege. I saw quite a bit of that in the past couple of years. And so that's been, not everything's been good news, not everything's been encouraging in the past 2 years, but that's one thing that I've seen quite a bit of. And that's not something that goes away. You don't just stuff that conversation back into the bottle. So I think that's one of the most valuable things that's happened over the past 2 years.
Mm-hmm. And have you found that executives that are speaking out about that particular thing are comfortable in doing it, or did they need your assistance or others in helping them craft their message? Kind of, what was the process to get them to be able to speak out? Or, was it coming from the heart? They felt so strongly about it that they knew they had to say something.
I would say some of both. I think some leaders just stepped into that space and spoke from the heart, and maybe didn't say everything perfectly, but it came from the heart. And I think it was obvious that it came from the heart and that it was authentic and they were demonstrating some vulnerability. I think some of those leaders needed some coaching. They needed some help and some time in crafting those messages. So I would say some of both.
Yeah. Well, and I think when they were speaking from the heart and showing their vulnerability, that is much more impactful than those messages that you know are exactly
Great.
perfect. So, with that general progress and what people are doing differently, now when you think for this whole 2 year period, what can you share with us that are some specific things that organizations did that moved the needle, that made this effort more substantive, I'll say?
I would say there's a lot of organizations that had, oftentimes for the first time, open, candid conversations about race and about racism. And not all of those conversations were perfect or neat or had a bow on top, but they were valuable, important conversations. I think that's one of the important things that happened. I think there's more organizations today than ever before that have people dedicated to doing this work inside of them. And I would also say, and this kind of goes back to my previous comments, I think there are more.
Joe, I'm going to stop you and we'll
Oh,
just edit this out because you froze for a second.
oh,
Now it looks like I'm frozen.
you're not frozen on my end.
Okay, great. Okay,
Where did
so
I?
start, yeah, let's pause, count to three in your head, and then answer the question again.
So I think one of the valuable things that happened in a lot of organizations was there were open, candid conversations about race and racism. And in a lot of organizations, that was the first time that there was an open conversation about that and about the reality of that and about the way that employees felt around some of those things. I think that's important, and some of that has continued in some of those organizations. I think
And
there's
in
more.
you, I'm sorry, in your own work, were you coaching them or facilitating some of that process?
I co-facilitated some of those conversations. I usually always try to co-facilitate that with a person of color, but yeah, that's a big part of what I did in probably June and July and August of that year was participate in kind of town hall conversations about race and racism and systemic racism. So I think there's some real value in that for employees and for the organizations. I think there are now more organizations than ever before that have hired people to do this work, to take responsibility for this work on the inside. A lot of those organizations aren't hiring those people in the right way or structuring that position the right way because it's the first time they've done it, but they'll learn from the process. And I would also say there's more executives today than ever before that are aware of their own incompetence in this area. For a long time now, senior leaders have been expected to get it. And so they got good at saying that they got it. And I think they believed it, but they hadn't really done the work. And I think there's a lot more of those leaders that are engaged in the work, that are engaged in reflection and educating themselves and listening and trying to learn about the experiences of others. I think there's a lot more of that going on than there was 2 years ago.
Great. Can you think of a specific example that comes to your mind as you think of those executives that are doing this work?
Yeah, so I was in a town hall forum for Union Pacific, Fortune 500, big old company, railroad company, and goodness, crazy lightning and thunder outside my house right now. And their CEO, a middle-aged white man, was speaking openly about systemic racism, not in society or in the universe, but in Union Pacific. That conversation would have never happened 5 years ago inside of that organization. And so I think not everything's been roses in the past 2 years. And I'm not saying there aren't some organizations that have, came out and make big commitments and then didn't do anything. But I think there have been some important steps forward that have been taken since May of 2020.
What has been the employees' response to all of this activity?
Gosh, there's been a lot of different responses. I think regardless of what an organization is doing, there are always a few people that think there's too much focus on this work, and there's always some people that think there's not enough focus on this work. People are in so many different places. But I think for the most part, the responses inside organizations that are making legitimate efforts, I think the majority of the responses have been positive and supportive. I think most people are supportive of this work. There's probably some disagreements and how to do the work and what the priorities are. But I think for the most part, people are supportive of this work.
Hmm. And probably those that are really, really, really not supportive, at least in the workplace, they're afraid to say anything. They're, kind of go along with it because there's a critical mass of people that are supportive of it. That's been my experience.
I think that is true. I do think we're starting to see a little bit more of a vocal, organized resistance. And I would point to the recent, I don't even know what the right word, campaign against critical race theory as an example. There's certainly some talking points being circulated through different networks, and I hear some of the same language show up in some of those conversations. So I think we are starting to see a little bit of a backlash to the response during 2020, but I think it's still in the minority.
So we're getting into the question I want to ask next, but before I do that, because you mentioned critical race theory, and so many people have no idea what it really is, and you don't
Right.
teach it in kindergarten.
Right.
However, I have completed 2 Zoom forums on that topic with 2 experts. So for those of you who want to check that out, if you haven't seen it already, just go to ubuntuglobal.com/blog. I believe it's going to be blog, but it'll be on my website, and you can watch those 2 videos anytime to get a much better understanding of what critical race theory really is. So we've been touching on barriers, and now I'd like you to go deeper. What do you see, especially as we move forward and we move further away from 2 years ago with George Floyd? What barriers do you see within organizations, number one, and specifically for internal DEI consultants, especially, or not consultants, but internal folks that they have hired to do this work?
I think one of the biggest barriers that faces this work inside organizations is still the idea that this work is somehow political, that it's political and it's politically divisive. And I think there's a lot of people in the world that are simply confused about what this work is about. This is, and I think sometimes we do ourselves a disfavor when we focus so much on making the business case for this work. We've got to make it profitable. Like, at the very foundational level, this is about humans working and living and thriving together. That's what this work is about. There's really nothing political about this work, but there's such a strong sense that this work is political. I think a lot of the resistance to this work is uninformed or misinformed. And again, the critical race theory conversation, I think, is a good example of that. I think the challenges facing internal practitioners right now is some of the same challenges that have always been in place for them. They're kind of isolated. They're generally under-resourced. They're misunderstood. They've got more actual responsibility than they have authority. I think companies continue to structure these positions and to locate them incorrectly. And I think a lot of folks, especially if you're the first DEI lead in your organization, I think a lot of those people are set up to fail. And I'm not saying that's intentional. I don't think it is, but and I think because of that, we're at a time today where we've got an unprecedented amount of burnout and stress. And there's a lot of people that are thinking about leaving this work. Their companies stepped out in public and made big promises 2 years ago. And some of those companies have been backsliding and backsliding and backsliding. And the people that do this work, like, they don't do it for the work, or they don't do it for the pay, they don't do it for the accolades. They do it because they care deeply about this work. And I think it's when your company doesn't follow through on their promises, I think it's pretty hurtful, and it's pretty damaging. So I think the challenges facing the internal leads are the same as they've always been. I think it's been amplified a little bit over the past couple of years. It's been there's a lot of things that have gone on in the past 2 years.
Well, so often what happens, especially with that first person that is hired or promoted into that position, is everyone that has been doing some things in the past. And, okay, we got Lenora now. She's the employee in charge of this. We don't need to do it anymore. Or, Joe can take care of that. So people don't realize that it's everyone's responsibility in some way, not just that person. And that certainly can cause burnout on top of. So when you have that happen, and then if you don't have executives that are talking about this all the time, really making it a forefront issue, then that can certainly cause people to be quite frustrated. So
Absolutely.
Joe,
It doesn't matter who you've hired. It doesn't matter who you've hired. If the executives, your organization is going to be as inclusive as your senior leaders decide that it's going to be, regardless of who you've hired to do the work. Like this work is about leadership more than it is about anything. But I think what you said is exactly right. So many organizations offload all of the responsibility onto one person or a council, and that's not actually their role. Their role is to guide that work, but it's not to deliver all of it. That's an impossible task. I think I interrupted you. I apologize.
Oh no, that's okay. You were going right to where I was going, so I appreciate that. So you do this work when you're presenting, which is how I know you initially. Is so different than other people. You're unique in how you do this work. Share with us a couple of things that you do, or things that maybe you say, or how you show up that grabs people, that gets their attention.
Thank you. That was very kind of you to say. Um, so most of my work is about inclusive leadership and talking about what that looks like in behavior. I think there's a lot of leaders that want to say they're inclusive, but they can't point to specific behaviors or practices. I think they're talking about their intentions, what kind of person they want to be. And inclusion isn't about your intentions, it's about what you do. Intentionally, deliberately, and proactively to be inclusive. And so a lot of my work is on that topic. I spend a lot of time with leaders, helping them deploy a more inclusive form of leadership. I think a couple of the things, based on the feedback that I get, a couple of the things that I do that resonate with folks is one, I usually spend some time sharing my own story. So I am a straight, white, middle-aged man, and I benefit from a great deal of privilege, social privilege. And for a big chunk of my life, I had no idea that was true. In fact, when someone sat down and tried to explain to me that I was privileged, I was deeply offended, which is hysterical because you'd have a hard time finding a more privileged person than I am. So I wasn't born into this work. A whole lot of things had to change along the way. Things had to change here, and things had to change here. And so I tell some of that story. I talk about some of the low points and some of the turning points in my life, some of the things that I believed in the past and why I believed them and how those things changed. And I think, we talked a little bit earlier about vulnerability. I think vulnerability is a way to build trust with people. And I think that invites people into a little bit more of a candid, trusting conversation with me. I own some of my stuff. I start off by just owning some of my stuff and talk about, let me tell you about where I came from. And we've all got a different story, but everybody's got one of those stories. We all came from someplace. We all absorbed some stuff growing up. We all learned some things about people like us, about people different from us. And the reality is this work is a journey. It's an ongoing process of change. And so I think there's value in being honest about where you came from and about where you're at today. And I think if you're able to do that, maybe you can be courageous and creative in thinking about, and here's where I'm going next. These are the next steps forward for me. That story seems to resonate with folks. I talk about the importance of common language. I always try to put core definitions in place. When I say diversity, this is what I mean. When I say inclusion, this is what I mean. I think so many of those conversations lack common language. We're all using the same words, but we're talking about different things. I think those are a couple of things that resonate with folks. When I think one of the other things that seems to resonate is when I try not to talk a lot about the business case, because I think, like I said earlier, I think this is just about human beings living and thriving together. I don't think it has to be profitable. But when I talk about the value or the why for this work, instead of talking about the big organizational things, like we've got to compete for all available talent, which is a real thing, I talk about how the sense or the experience of being included impacts how I feel and show up as an individual and how I contribute to our team. I think that's closer to home for a lot of folks in the workplace than whether the organization is competing for all available talent or not. And there's a lot of good research. There's brain science and other things that show if a human being spends 6 or 7 or 8 hours a day feeling included and welcome, like an insider, like they belong, they're going to show up in a profoundly different way than if they spend those same 6 or 7 or 8 hours feeling like an outsider, feeling excluded, feeling like they don't belong. Their brain is going to function differently. They're going to feel differently. They're going to feel differently towards you, and they're going to contribute differently. I don't think that's not calculus. I think people can appreciate that and understand that, and that connects to the fact that we've all got a contribution to make to this work. Like, again, this doesn't belong to Lenora or Joe or the Diversity Council. I can impact, regardless of my role, I can impact how included the people around me feel every single day with behavior and decisions that I make. And so I think for some people that brings it a little bit closer to home. But I think, there's a lot of talented folks in this work that approach it in very different ways. And I think we need a lot of narratives and a lot of voices and stories. But I think those are some of the things that I do that I seem to get good feedback on.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And a little bit earlier when I was asking you about those facilitated sessions, and you said you like to do it with a person of color. In this case, because they were specifically around race.
Yep.
One of the things that I'm always saying to people that come up to me, white, straight men, when they say, I care about this work and I want to do it, but I don't think I can. And I ask why. Of course, they say because they're straight white men. And I'm like, that's the reason you need to do it. And so I am just so thrilled that you are on this path, on this journey, helping people understand from a heart place, from a human place, why this work is so important, not just to the people that the leaders would impact, but to themselves as well, because when they really get it, they get it internally. And I believe that people don't get that and just leave it at work. It then impacts their whole life. So Joe, if folks want to get in touch with you directly, and we'll certainly put this in the write-up for the forum, but just tell us, what's the best way to follow you, to get in touch with you, etc.?
Yeah, probably the easiest way is my website, joegerst.com. There's contact information and social media information available there.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much. And we just might have to do this again where we go into great detail, not just on race, because I know when you talk about bias and that type of thing, you're not specifically focusing on race. You're covering lots of different areas of it. So stay well, stay safe. And again, thank you so much for sharing.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for your friendship and for your leadership. Thank you.
Welcome, Lisa Moore, head of Jedi Experience. I'm excited to have you here, and certainly our viewers are going to want to know what Jedi stands for. But before we jump into that, they have already viewed Joe talking about the DEI experience since the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. He's a consultant, and so he was really speaking more from the perspective of his experience working with lots of companies. I have been blown away by your experience with Guardian, how you have led them to not only do some extraordinary things, but 2 years later, it's still sustainable. So our viewers are going to want to know about those types of things. So you've had such great success. Let's first start with your title. What is Jedi? And then talk to us a bit about what Guardian did right away, or soon after the murder of George Floyd.
Well, thank you, Lenora. This is very exciting to get to talk about the work that we're doing at Guardian, and it's definitely a passion of mine. And so Jedi actually came about in 2021. It wasn't our first step. And it stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And the reason that it came about, before I get ahead of myself, is because we were already doing really good work in diversity and inclusion, and we wanted to bring in the focus on justice as it relates to social, economic, environmental, and really hone in on equity so that people get what they need. And so that happened in 2021, and that became my title in 2022, which is part of the momentum. But if we go back to George Floyd's murder, Guardian's executives immediately reacted. We got notes of support, and then we had a lot of action. And so what happened, I was actually a culture transformation and employee experience person. And the company immediately said, we want to elevate inclusion and diversity as a part of our cultural driver. We need to be, we want to embed inclusivity into the culture, the fabric of our culture. And so what we did was we established a leadership council, which I know some people hear council and think, oh, that's another team. This is a very dynamic council. It's got several groups that form it. On every group is a senior leader. And so they set about helping to guide the initiatives. What does Guardian need and how do we move forward? We also set up an advocates group, which is comprised of ERG leaders and others that want to advocate, have a passion for this. And so that group helps communicate and raise awareness and understanding in all sides of the organization. So up, down, sideways, each way. And then another very important thing we did was establish some goals for the organization. We call them bold goals. And it really incorporates everything that you can think of in terms of diversity, from supplier diversity to training and development, to looking at our populations, to our field piece. All of that is encapsulated in our bold goals.
Wow. So it sounds to me that, well, first of all, your organization, Guardian Life, was already doing work in the space of DEI, broadly speaking. And so 2 years ago, they realized they needed to make a shift. Now, and I would say from my experience as a consultant, and particularly over these last 2 years, as I've worked with organizations to help them get going or get unstuck or to start from scratch, that the justice piece is the piece they get nervous about. So talk to us about your executives, and did they have any external statements? Did they get involved with any organizations externally? Because it sounds like they already had that commitment at some level, and you helped them move it forward.
Yes, definitely a commitment, and we've won awards for HRC. I can't even think of all the awards, and so those relationships were already established. What we wanted to do was get everybody really comfortable speaking with each other and understanding each other, and really focusing on how we can leverage and support differences. And so that's our first year, 2020, we started with the council, the advocates, we had our ERG leaders included, and then we came up with a rally cry, which we call actually hashtag Together for Change. And that just meant that we all were united in positive change. And as a result of that, we mapped out the journey for the organization, recognizing we'd already been involved. And then we paralleled that with a path for each person, because we are all at a different point in our journey. And so what we wanted to do was provide an opportunity for everybody, no matter their point in the journey, to have something that they related to that resonated with them. And so they laugh at me often, but I kept saying, this is like a street fair. And I don't know if you want a cinnamon pretzel or a salted one or a mustard one, but we want to have all of those available, because we all think differently and have different experiences. And so we had a very robust end of 2020, and we brought in outside speakers that helped us with our thought leadership, which speaks to what you're saying, bringing in some of that outside thinking. We also had every executive, every senior executive sponsored either a training or a learning or a rollout of the goals. I mean, every single one created a video and talked about not just the importance of this as the right thing to do, but also good for our business, good for our colleagues, good for our partners, and good for our customers. And so that's how we ended 2020. And then 2021, that's when I was thinking, we've got to bring in that justice and equity piece. And so we introduced this Jedi program, which is, believe this or not, and some people are going to say, what? It's a 40-hour program. That is a chunk of time, but it's based on the fact that it's high touch and very experiential. And so my personal goal, and I wrote it down as a personal commitment, and that's what all Jedi do, by the way. We all first start with a personal commitment, and it should be measurable, and time, it's a SMART goal.
Mm-hmm.
Mine was, I wanted to get 100 brave leaders to go through this 40-hour immersive program. And
now tell me about break leaders, you said. Who are they?
Brave.
Oh, brave
leaders.
I'm
courageous. I'm sorry. Courageous, because you have to be courageous to say, I'm going to take 40 hours of my time and set it aside for effectively what was a test and learn.
Mm-hmm.
And the program includes everything from listening to abundant thinking, to inclusive practices, to listening to power and intent. It is a very comprehensive program, and there are experiential pieces to it. And then there's a whole debrief, and you sign on for 3 sessions and you debrief as a team. And so we had people from very senior to the front line learning together every other Friday, and really talking in a safe space about their thoughts and their feelings. And it just broke down so many barriers. The result of, go ahead, sorry.
How large, when they would come together in these debriefs, how many people would typically be in a session?
It could be 50 to 100. So I wanted 100, I got 117. So I was thrilled with that for our first test and learn. So it would be 50 to 100. We hosted multiple sessions because we know everybody can't join at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And we had personal assessments. We had a mesh assessment, which is from a company. And we had Dr. Lino Kiramancherry come in and share his thoughts and help us work through exercises. And then we had other immersive learning pieces, videos. We had self-paced learning, we had cooperative learning. And so this was part of everyone having an opportunity to embrace where they learn the best, where they learn the most, the mode that they learn. And so it sounds like a lot of work, and everyone pitched in and they're so passionate about it.
Mm-hmm.
The result of 2021 at the end was a graduation where people talked about how this program had changed their lives. And for me, that's what I live for. But they talked about where they were raised, how they were exposed, and what they had learned. And so as a result of this entire experience, we created a community where it's psychologically safe to be yourself, and to share what you're thinking. With all of the hate in the world, sometimes it's really difficult, even for me, to express what I'm feeling and thinking. And there have been too many times that I've gone to this community and said, look, I'm just not my best self today. I'm not processing this. And there's a community there, and it's everybody. It's from the front line to the senior. It's across the company in different groups. It's different ages, different generations. And they listen and then support. And that it has become amazing. And so as we go into 2022, our goal is 1,000 Jedi, so tenfold. And there's an enterprise goal, because we're supported by our executives, of 50% of our people leaders by the end of this year, and the other 50% by next year. And
wow. So obviously you're getting a tremendous amount of support in order just to facilitate all of that. I mean, to put it all together, to kind of help people and track it and have some idea of how many people have actually gone through it. So with that amazing success, there had to be some roadblocks somewhere along the line. What were they, and how did you overcome them?
Yes, there's a lot of road. This role, I think, in any organization is, I sometimes say it's Pepto Bismol and secret solid, because you are constantly thinking, I have to put this out there and let's see how it lands. I think some of the roadblocks were people just believing that it was possible. So, for instance, Together for Change, there's a lot of pushback because we're thinking about people being at different points in the journey. Some are just becoming aware. Some are trying to understand. Some are already fully committed and thinking, why are we still talking about this? We need to get moving. We need to get things done. And some are so passionate that they are gone. They are on their journey, and they need nothing. And so for those that were just struggling with awareness, and in some cases just struggling with the conversations that needed to be had, and I'm not everybody, so I don't know. I do know I have guilt about things and I have shame about things, and so I imagine that everyone else also has that. And so as we're moving through this and talking, now we're talking openly about this, and it's in meetings and it's in town halls, and our president and CEO is talking about it. There's a little bit of discomfort. And so what you notice are people dragging their feet or saying they will, but they won't, or why are we doing this, or have we overdone this? Those are the biggest roadblocks. I will say this to you, and I've said it to the company. I have yet to ask anybody on the executive leadership team to offer support that they did not give me. I mean, and that could include, I asked them to have conversation circles, for instance, with some of our underrepresented executives. I said, would you, mind taking time, just a conversation on a regular basis? Absolutely. ERG, our employee resource group, which we're transitioning to business resource groups, sponsorship, every single one. Absolutely, I will do it. Some give money to help support memberships or to support another learning or training or development. They each sponsored months of activity and featured their employee resource groups. So there was more than that. And we also have deep dive conversations with each one, so that we're talking about where are we on our path and what else might we do. And those are uncomfortable for them sometimes, and for me definitely, but they have all been there. And I really can't think of a time that someone has said, nope, we're not listening. They might say, wait, let's think about that, or how might we do this differently, but never a no.
Yeah, that's really tremendous that you have that much success, and for people to be willing to go on this journey, which to do it successfully, that means you have to be willing to be vulnerable. Yes. And having these the various discussions, and know you have a community to go to when things are not sitting right for you, and be able to get different perspectives is just invaluable. It's truly invaluable. So what are you talked about what your goals are for this year, which, you went from 100 to 1,000 going through it. That's pretty huge. And what do you see? Let me ask the question this way. For our viewers who would love to have this type of success, whether they do something specifically the way you described or something else within an organization, what would be some of the things that you would recommend that folks do? Because I know this is not new to you. This was not new in 2020, but there are a lot of people who are in the position in their company because the company didn't have that position before as a DEI practitioner internally. And they might have said yes because they're so passionate about it, but now that they're in it, they're wondering what they need. So if they're just starting out, what are 2 or 3 things maybe that you can think of to help them along?
I think one thing is that I would talk about is the framework. And so we immediately stood up a framework. and it's got aspirational drivers that are behavioral, which I think are so important. And it's exist for others, eliminate barriers to contribution, and evolve the narrative. And so that's easy to remember. It's a continuum. You're moving along. You have to exist for others before you can eliminate barriers to contribution, and you have to create that psychological safety before you can evolve the narrative. So I think a framework, and we also have strategic pillars within that. We have measures, and we've incorporated our employee resource group. So that brings all of that together, and I think that's good, so that everybody has a sense of this is what we're doing, and if I'm taking this action, does it somehow fit in this framework? So I think that's good. Another thing is we created a statement that brought together what was already there, our purpose and our values of the organization. And then we talk about zero tolerance for hatred. And that gives everybody a starting point. If this is hatred, this is not tolerated here. And so as a result, that also helps define behaviors and who wants to work here and who wants to be a part of the narrative go forward. So we've done some other things in terms of defining JEDI, each component as a behavior. So, for instance, justice means clearing the path for equal access. So we've defined that. We have our rally cry, together for change. But I think one of our bigger successes is recognizing and celebrating. And so one of the things I designed was it's a Kennedy Center honor ribbon, and I think I packed it.
Yes, please show us if it's.
I packed it. Can you believe it? It's usually right here on my desk, and I think I packed it.
No worries. It is really, I've seen it before. I'm talking to viewers, obviously. I've seen it before, and it's really eye-catching. And then everyone wants to have it, right? So they have to do certain things to get it.
We created that, and it says justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. It says Guardian. It's in the Guardian colors, and you can wear it on the screen. And when we're together, like we were this week, you fold it up and you can bring it. It's so easy. I can't believe I don't have it. But we did that. We also created a digital badging system for LinkedIn. And so there's outward recognition, because 40 hours is a lot of education and experience and exposure and epiphanies. It's a lot. And so we created that. So I think creating that, people want to be a JEDI. And we recently had a senior leadership meeting, and I was able to have a JEDI booth at the end. And you should have heard the difference in terms of people walking to the JEDI booth. All you hear is, because we've shared so much with each other that the connection, was, I don't know, charisma. I don't know, what does that connect? I don't know. It was sparkly when we saw each other in person.
Well, I am so privileged to have been a very small piece of all of this work. I so appreciate that you called me in to just do one little tiny thing compared to this huge initiative that you have led and have gotten such great successes. And I was going to ask, how has that transformed into behavior, but you already have addressed that. And I think one of the key takeaways for all people who care about this topic, whether or not they are DEI practitioners at one level or another, is really getting the behaviors clear is so critical, because people think this is just touchy-feely stuff. But when they know, well, what does a justice behavior look like? Or when you said earlier, hate is not tolerated. Well, okay, hate can be thought about as a concept, but if somebody says something that lands as hateful to another person, now that other person knows that they've got permission and it's safe to say, that didn't land right with me, or whatever their words might be for their personality. My point is, by really focusing on the behaviors while you're also educating people on all those other factors that are integral to really building that inclusive environment, are key. We could go on talking more, and I may have to just invite you back just by
Okay.
yourself and live. I mean, we're both live. I hate when I say that. But we're taped right now, but we're live with each other. But perhaps come back another time where we can really go deep, just even on one of these sections, because I know I'm going to get a lot of feedback. So don't go away just yet, everybody. I do want to thank Lisa, and Lisa, don't go away either. But thank you, Lisa, for sharing so much with us. I know you are very proud of Guardian Life, and they are very proud of you. So we so appreciate your taking the time to share what your process has been over these last 2 years.
Thank you so much, Lenora.
You bet, you bet. On June 2nd, as a result of your registering for this session, on June 2nd, we will have a live Zoom forum, like my forums typically are, where you can ask questions and share. It's going to be me facilitating your questions and your experiences. It'll be an opportunity for you to share what it's been like for you for these last 2 years. And then that will probably, it usually does, will probably lay the groundwork for other topics that I will develop and share for future More Than Just Talk Zoom sessions. So June 2nd, you will receive the link for that within the next few days. We just wanted to make sure you will have seen this first before you're a part of that session. And with that, thank you everyone for being with us. Again, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Joe. Now that you've learned from the wisdom of Joe and Lisa, I bet you've got questions and want to share some of your experiences. We have created a special forum session just for you, just for those of you who registered for the May 25th session you have just viewed. You'll receive a link shortly. No need to re-register for that one. That session will be live. You'll have a chance to ask me any questions that you have and share your ideas and your suggestions and your experiences. It will not be taped. My hope is that will enable you to be more candid, because the only people that will see it and hear it are those that will be on that Zoom session. I look forward to seeing you on June 2nd at 3 p.m. Eastern. Don't click off just yet. My team and I put together a video about George Floyd and so many others, and that will roll right now. Please stay safe.